So I'm turning 30 years old in 2 months, which feels crazy to say out loud. And as I take a look back at my 20s, I'm honestly really proud of what I've been able to accomplish financially and sort of document here on this YouTube channel. However, like most people, there's still a ton of things that I wish I did differently because my 20s were far from perfect. So in this video, I want to be a bit more transparent with you guys and go over 7 of the biggest regrets that I've had over the past decade. Starting with my first regret here that might be a bit controversial, coming from a guy who talks a lot about credit cards, and that is getting high annual fee cards. Now, specifically with this, what I wish I did differently is I wish I didn't rush into getting all these expensive cards like the MX Gold and the MX Platinum as early on in my credit card journey as I did. So as a quick summary, I got my first basic no annual fee student credit card from Wells Fargo in July of 2016 at age 20 when I was in college. And then once I started my first corporate job after graduating, I got into the Chase trifecta by getting the $0 OG Chase Freedom card, the $0 Chase Freedom Unlimited, and the $95 per year Chase Sapphire Preferred between December 2018 and January 2020. Now those 4 credit cards together were a pretty good place to start, and I don't really have any regrets with getting those. But after I had those cards in my wallet, the next one that I decided to get in November of 2020 was the MX Gold, which cost $250 at the time. Then just a few months later, in February of 2021, I got the MX Platinum as well, which cost $550 back then. And obviously both of those MX cards have raised their annual fees to be a lot more over the past 5 years now. But even back in 2021, I found myself being 25 and paying close to $000 in combined annual fees across my 6 credit cards. Sure, I got a few sign-up bonuses, and I ran my numbers to know that the benefits on those cards technically would justify a lot of those fees, but still, I was making somewhere between $60,000 to $70,000 per year at the time, which didn't go that far in my area. And so my point here is that I think at that age in my life, I should have really just continued focusing on getting a few other low to no annual fee credit cards first, regardless of how much value I thought I potentially could get from the more expensive cards. My hot take here is that even though the numbers can make sense on paper to get those more premium cards, because they're going to come with credits to lower what we call your effective annual fee, I still think it's best for people to upgrade their credit card strategy slowly over time and really only start venturing into the top tier travel credit cards when it truly matches both their lifestyle and their salary. Next tier, regret number 2 for me is going to be using debit cards and cash to pay for everything throughout most of my early 20s. And this is another one that probably sounds crazy coming from me because of how much I love credit cards now, but it kind of just took a while for me to eventually learn about all the downsides to debit cards and the upsides to credit cards. Now, the reason why I was so focused on only using debit or cash to pay for everything is the reason why I think a lot of people have certain habits with their money when they become an adult. And that's because most of us learn from and actually have our financial habits passed down from our parents. So I remember growing up that my dad would mostly pay cash anytime we went out to dinner as a family. I remember always stopping at the local bank ATM when I was out running errands with my mom, so that way we could withdraw money. And if my parents ever did not have cash on hand to pay for something, then 9 times out of 10, I'd see them using a debit card. So I saw all of this, and then I just began repeating the same financial habits once I started making a little bit of my own money throughout different jobs and internships in my early 20s. And to me, using debit cards and cash just kind of seemed like the right thing to do, because it essentially was going to eliminate the risk of me ever getting into credit card debt, which I had heard so many negative stories about in the news when I was growing up as well. But once I started digging a little bit deeper, I learned that even though using cash and debit feels like it's safer on the surface, those payment methods actually were opening me up to a whole bunch of other risks instead. So for example, this one time when I was at the gym, someone broke into my gym locker and then found my wallet and a bunch of cash in it, and then they just took it because there's no cameras in the locker room and cash is not traceable. So once I finished up my workout and saw what had actually happened, there was pretty much nothing I could do. And then for debit cards, I always like to tell people this one story about how a few years ago someone in my family was using a debit card for all their spending, but then one day all of a sudden they noticed that tens of thousands of dollars went missing from their checking account pretty much overnight. Turns out their debit card information got stolen, and so somebody out there essentially had direct access into their checking account because of that. And I know that caused a ton of stress for that one family member because they had rent to pay and all these other bills as well, but not enough cash to cover all that stuff. Now, luckily, there still are protections in place, and so that person eventually did get their money back like 3 weeks later. But both of those real life examples have now kind of helped to reinforce my belief that credit cards are by far the superior payment method over debit cards and cash, as long as, of course, that they're used responsibly and you're paying them off in full. That's because most normal credit cards offer something that's called zero liability protection, which basically just means that you will not be held responsible for any unauthorized charges that are made with your card or with your account. So since you're technically using the bank's money to pay for things that you later pay them back for, that means that if you find out that there's a fraudulent transaction, then that's going to be the bank's problem to figure out, not yours. All you got to do is just call them up and then tell them that there's a charge on your card that wasn't made by you, and then they'll just wipe that transaction from your statement and investigate it themselves. So that security and that peace of mind is great, and it's one of the main reasons why now I just advocate for people to learn responsible credit card usage. Alright, moving on to my next regret here, which is going to be buying a car that I couldn't really afford immediately after graduating college. And so what happened with this was that after I graduated in May of 2018 from Penn State, I moved back in with my parents outside of Philadelphia to just save some money on rent. And my first full-time job to start my career was starting 3 weeks after graduation in central New Jersey, which was going to be an hour and 15-minute drive each way from me. That meant I obviously needed a car to get to work. And so after looking at a few listings online, I found a lightly used 2016 Nissan Altima that was for sale at a dealership right around the corner, which looked nice and it had the latest features. I thought that was great since it was only leased out to someone prior to going up for sale and it had very few miles on it, but it was going for around $15,000 at the time, which was a lot of money considering that I had very little saved up and I hadn't even received my first paycheck from my job yet. But still, I went ahead and bought it anyway with just a little bit down and a 5-year loan to finance the rest. And so after all was said and done, I was locked into a car payment of around $285 per month. Now, at the time, that didn't sound too bad because again, I was living at home and I wasn't paying rent. So I thought to myself, I can easily afford that car payment because I'm going to be saving a lot of money right now anyway. And even though $285 per month didn't break my budget, I still regret paying that much. I regret it because I could have easily bought a car that was just as reliable with a few more miles on it and a few less features at a lower purchase price. And I also regret not using something like the 24/10 car buying rule to kind of help guide me into making a more informed decision. The 24/10 rule says that if you're going to use a loan to buy a car, then you should be putting down at least 20% on that purchase. You should finance the car over a period of 4 years or less. And you should also make sure that your total monthly transportation costs, including stuff like gas, insurance, and maintenance, are no more than 10% of your monthly income. For me, I put less than 20% down. I financed for 5 years instead of 4 at the most. And I definitely did not factor in the other costs of operating a car as much as I should have, especially with how expensive the gas would be for such a long daily commute to work. That pretty much added another $250 in gas costs every month. Now again, buying this car did not put me into financial distress, but I really just wish I would have put a lot more thought into making such a large purchase under those circumstances. And I think another part of why I regret this purchase so much is just because after 5 months of commuting to that central Jersey office, I got the opportunity to actually transfer to the company's Philadelphia branch. And then at that point, I just moved into the city anyway, and I didn't even need a car anymore. Alright, next up here on my list of financial regrets is going to be lifestyle inflation, which I'll be honest, is something that personally I never thought I'd experience. But after looking back at my spending habits over the past decade, I definitely do think I've experienced at least a somewhat noticeable increase in my level of spending. So let's talk about it. Now, when I was really starting to kind of get into all this personal finance stuff in my mid-20s, I remember reading a ton of books and watching all these personal finance creators, and they would warn about falling into this trap of lifestyle inflation. And basically what that is when you increase your spending as your income starts to increase as well. Lifestyle inflation is one of the main factors that explains why over half of Americans making 6 figures are still living paycheck to paycheck. And so I always thought that was really interesting because I never believed that this would be an issue for me since I was living pretty comfortably even when I was making less than $70K per year. But sure enough, as my income began to increase over the course of my late 20s, I found myself living in a larger apartment. I was buying more expensive food. I got a dog, which has a ton of costs associated with that. And I was even spending more on certain travel costs, which I'll talk more about in just a minute. But basically, I was seeing my monthly expenses go up a lot over time. However, this is where the challenging part kind of comes in, because even though the numbers on my budgeting template were going up, it was also true that things just cost a lot more now in 2025 than they did way back in 2018 when I started my career. So what my wife and I have always done is we've maintained that budget that we have, and we've tracked pretty much every single dollar that we've ever spent. And then over the past few months, we've really tried to diagnose where there might be wasted excess spending across every category. For example, we found ourselves spending sometimes over $0.00 per month on groceries for just the two of us because of where we went out shopping for food. So we made some changes by switching up where we shop by going to Aldi, Trader Joe's, and BJ's Wholesale Club instead of Whole Foods and Wegmans. We started to make a bunch of other cuts as well, like limiting our shopping budget and other miscellaneous junk that we didn't think was necessary. And so basically we tried to just really define what brought us real actual value in our spending, and it's made a huge difference in starting to kind of offset some of that lifestyle inflation. So even though we've always kept our expenses much less than our income, it's good to sort of audit your finances every so often just to see what spending categories have gone up due to actual inflation and which ones have gone up due to lifestyle inflation. So if you want to check out how we budget and then download our free template that tens of thousands of other people have downloaded as well, then I'll go ahead and link that video on the screen right now and down below in the description as well. Now that leads me to my next regret that goes along with lifestyle inflation, and that would be staying at expensive hotels, including both hotels that I paid for in cash and hotels that I paid for in credit card points. So if you're a subscriber to my channel or you've just seen any of my credit card videos before, then you'll know that I'm a big fan of using my points of miles to help cover many of my travel costs like flights and hotel stays. I think it's the best use of points of miles when you know how to do it the right way, which is why I like to teach other people how to do the same thing I do. So just a quick reminder here to go ahead and subscribe down below if you haven't already. But there's a few different schools of thought for what's the best way to redeem for travel. On one hand, you have people who prefer to redeem for travel. That's more on the luxury side of things, like business class flights with lay flat seats, 5-star hotels, and all that other good stuff. And their reason for doing that is because that type of travel is typically reserved for the ultra wealthy. And so leveraging your points and miles can unlock those things that most of us couldn't afford otherwise. But then on the other hand, you have people who couldn't care less about flying in a pod in the sky because they just want to get to their destination where they can stay in a cheap accommodation. And so to them, it's more about just the adventure, and they want to kind of stretch out the value of their points miles to cover as many trips as possible where flying in economy is just fine. Obviously, there's a ton of options in between those two extremes, and I've explored using my own points across that entire spectrum. And out of all my credit card point redemptions and even the stuff that I've booked in cash during my travels, I think that what I regret most from a financial perspective are the luxury hotels. The perfect example of this would be something like the Bergenstock Resort near Lucerne in Switzerland that I just visited the other month. So this was a beautiful property with the best views overlooking Lake Lucerne, amazing restaurants, tons of amenities, and overall probably one of my favorite hotels that I've ever stayed at without considering the price that we paid. However, once we actually factor in the price, which was something crazy like $2,700 for a 3-night stay at the cheapest option they had in a secondary hotel on the property, now I really start to face some of the financial regrets that I was talking about. Again, we loved it there. It was super nice, and it was within our budget because we saved a ton of money on flights and some other hotel stays on this trip using our points. But considering that we spent every day there doing activities outside of the resort, like hiking on a place called Stew Ridge, checking out the top of Mount Pilatus nearby, and then exploring downtown Lucerne, we basically were only sleeping there and then paying that expensive price to do so. Because of that, looking back, we could have just easily saved money by staying somewhere else that was cheaper, since we were just going to be out exploring anyway. And this has really become a trend that I've noticed a lot in my travel spending over the past few years. To me and my wife as a couple in our 20s and now almost 30s without any kids or any other responsibilities, our trips typically involve a lot of activities and touristy type stuff that doesn't really require a fancy hotel. So I try not to have a lot of regrets with spending money on travel because ultimately the memories are priceless. But unless you're specifically taking a trip to stay at a certain hotel, my advice is just to save the money or the points and find a cheaper accommodation if you can. Alright, next regret on my list is going to be sports betting. And this one here is something that I really feel like I'm in the huge minority for as a guy in my age group, because I've completely cut out sports betting entirely for my life after kind of just trying it out for a few years when it first got more legalized. It's honestly crazy to think back to a time when commercials for companies like FanDuel and DraftKings didn't just dominate every single sports game you ever tried to watch, but for the first 23 years of my life, there just wasn't any widespread legalized sports betting here in the US like there is today. Eventually, though, some laws got passed, and then these sports books were allowed to operate in most states. And to me, there were really two dangerous things that occurred when this happened, with number one being just how quickly it became so normalized for all these commercials and celebrity spokespeople promoting it, and then number two being how easy it was to literally gamble your hard-earned money with just a tap of a button on your phone. So naturally, as a guy in my 20s who's been watching sports my entire life, and whose friends are also the same way, I kind of just found myself surrounded by people placing bets on pretty much any game for fun. And it really seemed like overnight, it just became a part of the culture for someone my age, where I almost felt like I'd be judged by not trying it out. So I loaded up some cash into a sports betting account, which also was just way too easy that it almost felt like fake money. And it really didn't take take too long to see just how fun and addicting it can be to win. But honestly, I started to see a pattern that I'd win some and I'd lose some. And so it was almost a wash as to whether I was actually profiting from this stuff. And then I'll be honest, right around that time, I started making some money online with all this YouTube stuff. And that really just became way more fulfilling than sports betting ever could be for me. So I just quit sports betting almost immediately. Ultimately, I realized that, yeah, it can be fun to bet something small if I was willing to lose 100% of what I was betting, but the money nerd in me just really couldn't accept the fact that betting on these games was just pure speculation. So yeah, I'm kind of glad I didn't make this a long-term habit. Now, speaking of speculation, that leads me to another regret that I have in my 20s, and that is going to be speculating on a couple of things for the short term versus investing that money for the long term instead. So this one's actually kind of funny to look back on, but way back in 2020, there was a ton of hype around sports cards, especially in the sport of basketball, where the value in all these star player rookie cards was just skyrocketing for some reason. I remember the prices for like the most basic Luka Doncic rookie cards were going for over $1,000 in a PSA 10 grade, and the prices for a ton of other players were into the hundreds of dollars as well. Basically, the idea was that people were kind of speculating on whether